Last week we started Chapter 9, World War II. We covered the rise of dictatorships and how Europe is plunged into war, and of course the Holocaust. But the war has only been in Europe between Germany, Italy, and the Allied countries. Now we're going to look at the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which will now bring Japan and the United States into the war, making it a global war. Now we're going to talk about the Battle of the Atlantic. Just like World War I, Germany wanted to starve Britain by sinking merchant ships bringing supplies with submarine warfare, or what they call U-boats. Here we see a German U-boat commander looking through a periscope, searching for Allied shipping, which they see through the periscope, firing a torpedo and sinking Allied ships. Now, to protect the merchant ships, the Allies grouped them into convoys. By 1943, the war in the Atlantic started to shift to the Allies as they sunk more and more U-boats. By this time, Germany will lose up to 734 of their U-boats. Using destroyers, dropping depth charges, they're able to sink more and more U-boats. Using new technology like sonar. In addition to that, the Allies broke the German secret code, the Enigma. Germans coordinate their U-boats with a secret code machine called the Enigma. The British capture a machine and eventually break the German code. British mathematician Alan Turing built an early computer to break the code. Germany never knew the British had broken the code. This was featured in the film The Imitation Game. We're going to shift to the Pacific Ocean and look at Japan. In the 1920s, Japan was quickly becoming an industrialized nation. Japan wanted to expand to control Asia, to create an empire. Unfortunately for Japan, it was an island with almost no natural resources like oil, iron ore, or rubber that they would need for their military. They needed to conquer other territories to gain these resources. So in 1937, Japan invades China. Now, the American response was that Roosevelt wants to help, but most Americans want to remain neutral. America felt we had enough problems at home. The Depression was going on, and we had a policy of isolationism. Isolationist groups like America First had 800,000 members, people like Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh, and my grandmother and grandfather. Roosevelt starts Lend-Lease Act to help Britain. America will lend Britain war equipment like tanks and planes until after the war. Japan did not want a war with the United States, but they knew that the U.S. would not allow them to conquer Southeast Asia. Now we'll talk about Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941. Japanese airplanes carry out a surprise air attack on Pearl Harbor. 350 planes launched from 6 aircraft carriers. Here we see Ford Island in the center of Pearl Harbor. This was actually a Japanese photograph. You can see the Japanese planes, and one had just launched a torpedo, which struck an American battleship, the USS Oklahoma. In a 90-minute attack, 8 battleships were either sunk or damaged, along with other ships. This is the USS Oklahoma, which had capsized. Over 1,100 men died on the USS Arizona. A single bomb had penetrated down into one of her magazines. That's where they keep all the gunpowder. It exploded, ripping the ship apart and killing over 1,000 men in a split second. Here is the Arizona burning the next day. 343 U.S. aircraft either damaged or destroyed. 2,403 Americans lost their lives, including 68 civilians. Most of them had been firemen who came to the airfields to help put out the fires. This is the memorial of the men lost from the USS Arizona. This is called the Punch Bowl Cemetery. It's where many of the victims from the Pearl Harbor attack were buried. Many of them were unknown. Today, the USS Arizona Memorial is a popular attraction. In this aerial photograph, you can actually see the USS Arizona still below the water at Pearl Harbor. The memorial stretches across it, but doesn't touch it. Sadly, the over 1,000 men that died that morning are still on board the ship. These are pictures of the memorial I took when I visited there about 10 years ago. This is a picture of one of the turrets. The main guns had been removed, but you can see in the lower left-hand corner an oil slick. Oil periodically drips out of the Arizona. There's still a lot of oil on board, and it comes to the surface, and they refer to this as the tears of the Arizona. Here we see a nearby air hangar on Ford Island, and you can still see the bullet holes from the Japanese planes. Even though the Japanese had a huge success sinking or damaging 8 battleships and other ships and killing all those men and destroying all those planes, it failed to strike targets that could have been crippling to the Americans, namely the U.S. aircraft carriers that were out at sea at the time of the attack. This is the photograph of the USS Enterprise, probably the most famous aircraft carrier the United States had in the war. It was in 20 battles. The following day, the United States declared war on Japan. Here is FDR in the House of Representatives giving his famous declaration of war. Now, 4 days later, on December 11th, Germany declares war on the United States. This was a huge mistake by Hitler, since he was not obligated to do it, and he only brought in America in a war against him. Now, this is going to bring in all 3 major countries, the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain, to fight against Germany, and will eventually lead to Germany's defeat. Now, after Pearl Harbor, America prepares for war. Tens of thousands volunteered to serve, and by the end of the war, 16 million Americans would serve in the armed forces. U.S. soldiers were called GIs, government issue. Unfortunately, the U.S. military was segregated, had been since the Civil War. Over 1 million black soldiers served, but mostly in support roles. Blacks had to serve in separate army units. In the very beginning, blacks were not allowed to join the United States Marine Corps. And in the Navy, blacks were relegated to busboys on board ships. Along with Pearl Harbor, Japan carries out other attacks in the Pacific. They capture the British cities of Singapore and Hong Kong. They capture the American islands of Guam and Wake. Their major goal was to capture the U.S.-controlled Philippine Islands. The military there was led by General Douglas MacArthur. The United States was caught by surprise and forced back to defend the Bataan Peninsula. The Bataan Peninsula is across Manila Bay from the city of Manila. After 5 months of fighting, all U.S. and Filipino troops in the Philippines are forced to surrender. MacArthur is ordered by Roosevelt to leave the Philippines, but he vows to return. In the Bataan Death March, 70,000 Filipino and U.S. prisoners of war were forced to march to a POW camp. Thousands died or are killed along the way. The camp was over 70 miles away and there was little food or water. Here we see American soldiers being led by the Japanese to the prisoner of war camp. The Japanese had very little respect for anyone who surrendered, so they had no compulsion whatsoever to kill any prisoner of war. Now, after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. would have to fight both Japan along with Germany and Italy. In the Pacific, this would mean defeating the Japanese Navy and capturing islands as they moved towards Japan. Admiral Chester Nimitz becomes the head of the U.S. fleet. Nimitz would develop the strategy of island hopping. Basically, what he would do is bypass and isolate strongly defended Japanese-held islands, where they would be left behind, not getting supplies, and eventually be forced just to surrender. This would save times and, more importantly, American lives. Naval warfare was forever changed with the airplane. Aircraft carriers were now the major naval warship. Battleships, once the most powerful weapon in any navy, had become obsolete. Now, Japan continues its success in early 1942. In May, the U.S. forces stop a Japanese fleet at the Battle of Coral Sea. Now, this battle is only fought by planes. It's the first time in history where neither side, neither fleet that is, saw the enemy. The battle is a draw, but Japan was stopped. Japan lost many of its planes and hurt future military plans. The U.S. stopped the invasion, but lost an aircraft carrier, which was very, very important. We didn't have very many at the time. We only had 4 in the Pacific. Japan sank the carrier USS Lexington, and another one, the USS Yorktown, was very badly damaged. Here we see pictures of American sailors abandoning ship on board the Lexington. About 2 years ago, the USS Lexington was actually found underwater in the Pacific Ocean. The Battle of Midway, June 4th to 7th, 1942. Japan attacks Midway Island, which is west of Hawaii. It's a very small island, it's only 2.5 square miles. It's barely above sea level, and it's about 1,300 miles west of Pearl Harbor. It's midway between the United States and Asia. This is why it gets its name. Here you can see on the map where Midway's position is in relation to Japan and Hawaii. In the battle, America will sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. Now, the Japanese were preparing to attack an American carrier, the USS Yorktown, which had been repaired after the Battle of Coral Sea. But while they were doing this, American dive bombers surprised them and attacked the Japanese carriers. It was devastating. Because so much fuel, bombs, and torpedoes were on the flight decks, the damage was increased with large explosions. 3 of the Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk in just 5 minutes. This was one of the American Dauntless dive bombers in the action of dropping a bomb. This wasn't from the actual battle. These are artist renditions showing the dive bombers dropping bombs on the Japanese aircraft carriers. A 4th Japanese carrier was found and sunk the next day. The Japanese do sink one of the American carriers, the USS Yorktown. The Battle of Midway is a decisive victory for America and a turning point in the war in the Pacific. Just 5 minutes changed the course of the war. Japan, which had been on the offense, has now been stopped, and coming only 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 300 planes, and 3,500 sailors and airmen, all of them irreplaceable. Japan will now be on the defense, but would hold out for over the next 3 years. Guadalcanal, August 1942 to February 1943. The U.S. is going to go on the offense. Its goal is to capture islands and move closer and closer to Japan. The first island they will attempt to take is Guadalcanal. It's a jungle island about 90 miles by 25 miles. It's in the South Pacific, not far from New Guinea. As we can see here on the map, you see Midway Island and Pearl Harbor in Japan. If you look down toward the bottom where the Battle of Coral Sea is, here we see Guadalcanal. On August 7th, 1942, U.S. Marines make an amphibious landing. This was the first time the United States had made an amphibious landing. Here we see the Marines coming ashore. The Japanese were totally taken by surprise, and there were almost no American casualties in the invasion. For the next 6 months, the Americans would fight the Japanese in the jungles, in the air, and on the waters around the island. Here we see some photographs of the American soldiers in the jungles. The Japanese would launch what they called banzai charges against the Marines. These were suicidal attacks, and the Marines were able to fight them off, and unfortunately, most of the Japanese soldiers would be killed. The Navy win a number of battles against the Japanese. Japan losses in ships, planes, and pilots can't be replaced. The Americans defeat the Japanese and capture the island of Guadalcanal. It was the first step in a long string of victories that would eventually lead to the surrender of Japan. All right, we're now going to shift back to Europe. In 1942, the war continues in Europe. The Germans are still fighting in Russia. And in that battle in 1942, the largest battle of the war will occur, the Battle of Stalingrad. It'll last from August of 1942 to February of 1943. Pretty much the same time period as the Battle of Guadalcanal is going on in the Pacific. Hitler wants to capture the Russian city of Stalingrad, mostly because it was named after the Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. And this will lead to the biggest battle in human history because Stalin does not want to let a city that's named after him be captured by the Germans. So both sides are going to pour more and more soldiers and resources into the battle. Now, after 3 months of fighting, the Germans occupy most of Stalingrad. This was the famous children dancing around the alligator statue that was in Stalingrad. There was brutal house-to-house fighting. Here are German soldiers and Russian soldiers. But while Hitler is preoccupied with Stalingrad, the Soviets surround the city, trapping 250,000 German, Romanian, and Italian soldiers. Winter sets in. Thousands of German soldiers die of frostbite, malnutrition, and disease. The Soviets surround and trap the Germans in Stalingrad, and the Germans are forced to surrender. Here we see a picture of a Russian soldier with a German prisoner. Field Marshal Paulus, 22 generals, and around 91,000 German soldiers surrender. The Battle of Stalingrad is the largest single battle in human history. The Soviets would be on the offense from then on. This is the turning point of the war in Europe. The battle lasted 199 days, and the Germans suffered 850,000 casualties. 96,000 became prisoners of war, and only 8,000 would ever see Germany again. The Soviet military losses were around 750,000, and some say may have been as high as 1 million. For the next 2.5 years, Germany would fight a brutal defensive war against the Soviet Union and what became called the Russian Front. Now, the last part we're going to cover is North Africa. Axis and Allied forces had been fighting in North Africa since 1940. The Italians did very poorly and were on the verge of losing to the British. So in 1941, Hitler sends a small force called the Afrika Korps to Africa to save the Italians from losing. The Afrika Korps was led by one of Germany's best generals, Field Marshal Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, He was extremely successful. Now the Germans and Italians fight the British and their allies back and forth for almost the next 2 years. But in October of 1942, the British Army stops and defeats the Germans at the Battle of El Alamein, about 60 miles west of Cairo. The British Eighth Army is led by one of Britain's best generals, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. After the British victory at El Alamein, Montgomery and the British would push Rommel and the Germans west through North Africa into Tunisia. They would capture the capital city of Tripoli in Libya, and the Germans would be pushed into Tunisia. Shortly after this, the Americans would land at Morocco and Algeria, and trapping the Germans and Italians at Tunis. Well, this ends our section on global war. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of your day. Goodbye.